Hi everybody, Andrew Stanek here again, and today I'm going to be reading Chapter 2 of Death by Nostalgia. Chapter 2. A rather important-looking man was trudging down the ancient concrete steps into the bunker. Virtually everything about him looked important, from the chest full of medals he wore on his GRPD police uniform, to the grizzled inveterate gray of his hair, to the flat, wide brim of his cap. In addition to looking important, this man also looked very angry. The ends of his grizzled, important-looking mustache were curved into bobbing, frowning anger. Unfortunately, in the experience of Detective Sam L. Alders, angry, important people descending the stairs onto his crime scene was usually bad news. "Chief," Alders said, saluting him quickly. Chief Breckenridge gave Alders a withering, scathing look that made Detective Alders quite sure he was going to have a very bad day. He plunged his hands into his jacket pockets to warm them. Unlike Breckenridge, Alders was in plain clothes, and he had a sneaking suspicion that the chief was about to start yelling about his somewhat patchy appearance. However, his suspicions were proven wrong in the next instant, as the chief began to yell about something else entirely. "Do you have any idea how much of a scandal this is going to be?" the chief barked furiously. "While I was up there giving a speech about how the destruction of these ancient projects buildings, this urban squalor, was going to bring down crime," he paused dramatically, "at exactly the same time, someone was down here, just under my feet, murdering some poor woman." Alders felt it was best to say nothing. "Not a word of this to anyone. I don't want the media to catch a whiff of this, you understand? Not a whiff." "Yes, sir," Alders replied stiffly. "Now where the hell are we?" the chief asked, looking around his surroundings, apparently for the first time. He eyed the drab concrete floor and walls with a certain amount of distaste. What looked like a lifetime's worth of muck, grime, and dirt had accumulated in a patchy layer on the ground. Ancient-looking army helmets hung from one wall, on a table above numerous rows of boots. A series of vicious-looking cracks ran along the floor, leading to a sort of flimsy-looking wooden wall with a chain-link fence around it, and a rusty iron door, ajar, leading through it. "We're looking into that," Alders answered quickly. "There's no record of this place existing in City Hall. It's apparently some kind of military bunker. After they demolished the building, the construction workers punched through the roof. They thought it was part of the foundation. I spoke to some of the residents, and they said that there were old tunnels beneath the apartments." "And the victim?" asked the chief. Alders nodded quietly, and led him deeper into the room. A large hole had been cut in the roof of the room, and light was streaming through the top. It illuminated the body of a woman, lying face up on the ground, a look of surprise outlined on her face. An obvious crimson wound had been inflicted in her chest, and blood was pooled around her feet. "We were just about to move her," Alders commented, dragging a white cloth over her lifeless form. "Her name is Adriana Kettering, according to her personal effects. It looks like she was a doctor. We have yet to contact her family or her place of work." "Cause of death?" "Single gunshot wound through the heart. Estimated time of death is around noon." "Definitely murder, then?" Alders nodded solemnly. "Well, if you're going to move her, then move her." Alders barked some orders up the stairs, and the body was removed. "We found the murder weapon," Alders said after the body had gone. He led the chief to the back of the bunker, where the wooden wall in front of the chain-link fence stood. They passed through the open door into the rear of the room. Alders braced himself, quite sure that the chief wasn't going to like this. Behind him, he nearly felt his superior explode with anger. Hanging on the walls were weapons of every sort. Rifles, pistols, knives, grenades, shotguns, machine guns, boxes of ammunition, and more. But standing out in front of all the weapons was a single large and wicked-looking rifle, mounted on a nearby stand. It was positioned and pointed exactly at the spot where Adriana Kettering must have been standing before she was shot. The rifle looked quite ancient, covered in dirt and dust, with cracks running along the wooden stock and barrel. But mounted on the stand it appeared quite deadly. "Dear God, this is going to be a scandal," Breckenridge said, shaking his head. "A dead woman in a room full of weapons? I want this case sorted out and cleared quickly and quietly," the chief was saying. "Who are the chief suspects?" "Sir, we don't have any suspects yet. I've only just arrived on the scene. I don't know anything about this woman, and probably won't until I've spoken to her family and learned who might want to do her harm. I'd say that this was obviously a premeditated murder. Someone must have stood behind this wooden separator and waited with the rifle for the victim to enter. then fired. I think they must have forced this door as well. It's open, but it's still locked. This lock looks rusted through. I doubt it could have been unlocked even with the key. It sounds like you have a lot of unanswered questions in your investigation, Alders, the chief said gruffly. You'd better start answering them. Yes, sir. Alders paused. He couldn't see how he could possibly be held responsible for not having solved the crime, having only been at the crime scene for less than an hour, and was weighing his next words carefully. If it's just me investigating, this could take some time. I could actually use more manpower on the case. Well, you won't get any. Between security for the governor's convention and all the other open cases we're trying to clear, there's no one to spare. Besides, I want to draw as little attention to this as possible. I don't want any media buzzing around. So yes, Alders, it's just you, and you'd better damn well solve this case. This was so unreasonable that Alders was about to protest, but thought the better of it. He coughed. Yes, sir. However, I will have some trouble taking statements from all the people who were in the area around noon, if it's just me working on this investigation. The chief snorted. Witnesses? That raises another question. This stairwell reads straight up, doesn't it? He said, gesturing to the stairs he'd entered by. Sound ought to carry. A shot, particularly one from a large rifle like that one, should have been easy to hear from where the crowd was. Why didn't anyone report hearing the gunshot? I don't know, sir, muttered Alders. The chief looked as if he was about to respond, when another voice cut through the still air of the bunker. So glad to hear that the GRPD has sent its best and brightest to conduct this investigation. There was the sound of light footfalls as a man descended the concrete stairs and came into view. He was a lithe, tall man, with dark hair intermingled with streaks of gray, wearing a large, baggy coat that hung off at odd angles. It was the same man who had stood for hours on end at the construction site. The chief's eyes widened in surprise as he looked up and saw the man, while Alders merely frowned at him. For your information, the stranger continued, no one reported the gunshot because no one heard the gunshot. Except, of course, for me. The shot was fired as the explosives above were being detonated, and was masked by the sound of the demolition. Therefore no one, not the crowd, nor yourself, Chief Breckenridge, standing above, noticed it. It was merely mixed in with the ambient noise, and sounded like another explosion. I, however, have slightly more discriminating ears. The stranger smiled. His face was quite pale, almost ghostly. Chief Breckenridge's face, on the other hand, was red. Who the devil are you? Alders asked, his frown deepening. Felix Green, private investigator, he answered with a curt nod to Alders. He's a hack who's running around calling himself a detective, Breckenridge said between clenched teeth, and Felix, you will get the hell out of this crime scene before I have you arrested. You won't have me arrested, Felix answered calmly, because if you do, I'll talk to the media, who I'm sure will be very interested to know how you, the chief of police, failed to notice a murder beneath your own feet. And you will forgive me for saying so, but I'm somewhat ahead of you. This murder has every appearance of premeditation, as it required the killer to secrete himself, or herself, behind that wooden barricade and wait for the victim. What's more, it required very exact timing. The shot had to be fired precisely as the explosion was going off. Now, Adriana Kettering met with 6 friends today. Her brother, Jack Kettering, Mr. William Hamilton and Mrs. Reva Hamilton, Davy Kempt, Vicky Melbrush, and Staff Sergeant Peter Ulverson, U.S. Army. She mentioned to them that she was thinking about visiting this bunker, where they apparently used to play as children. I assume she was unaware of the weapons stored on the other side of this wall, he said, gesturing to the wooden divider and the old iron door. I find it reasonable to assume that the murderer must, therefore, have been one of these 6 people. Alders was rapidly writing down the names that Felix had ticked off. How do you know all this? Alders asked suddenly. I believe I mentioned I have a very discriminating ear, Felix replied smoothly. I happened to be standing nearby as they discussed the matter, and I listened in. Nothing malicious, I assure you. It was simply a matter of discovering the identities of the speakers. There was an old list of the residents of these buildings that the media was examining, and I looked through them. But how could the murderer have been sure that she was in the bunker at the right time? Alders asked, unless it was simply coincidence that... Do not discuss the case with this man, Chief Breckenridge broke in suddenly. And why not? Felix asked. I won't charge a fee. Of course you won't, Breckenridge said between gritted teeth. Alders, a word? The chief drew the detective aside and began to speak to him. Listen, Alders. Felix getting a hold of this case could be even more disastrous than the media. Why? The detective asked with surprise. He seems as if he has a reasonably good handle on what's going on, and at the very least, I have to interview him as a witness. A reasonably good handle? Oh yes, he always has a good handle on things. He's nearly a perfect investigator. Do you know what's wrong with him? No, Alders replied slowly. Breckenridge took a deep breath. He appeared to be starting on a deeply personal rant. I've encountered people who have used him as a private investigator. They always say the same thing. Oh, Felix Green. He was very clever, polite, discreet, intelligent. Solved the case, found my missing cat or what have you. Fee very reasonable. Nice man. Then what's the problem with him? He steals things, hissed Breckenridge. Not just evidence from crime scenes. Valuables, trinkets. Anything. He's a kleptomaniac. I know he is. We've just never been able to catch him at it. Or rather, we have, but he always manages to wriggle out somehow. He gets near this case and all those weapons we saw hanging on the wall will be gone by the end of the day, and then I'll have to answer questions about what happened to a dozen rusty assault rifles. There was a certain manic glint in Breckenridge's eye as he said this, and Alders was quite sure there was more to the story, but he did not inquire further. Instead, he walked back to the center of the room, the chief fuming in the tow. Are you done speaking your biased and unfounded slanders against my good name? Felix asked with mock courtesy. Good name my foot, spat Breckenridge. Get the hell out of here. Suit yourself, Felix said with a shrug. He turned to go. But you know, if the media does find out about this, they'd probably start asking even more inconvenient questions for you, Chief. For example, why you only assigned one officer to a murder investigation, for a start. Breckenridge stared daggers at the back of Felix's head. Are you threatening me? The chief grunted. Because, Green, I can have you locked up in a heartbeat. I'm not threatening you, Felix answered coolly. I'm just trying to show you that you can both serve the cause of justice and public opinion at the same time. I understand you've been campaigning to have these old projects apartments knocked over for a long time. GRPD claims that they're the center of much of the city's criminal activity, and it would be a rather large embarrassment for you and the department if the media discovered there had been a murder on the site, right under your nose, with the towers scarcely demolished. But if they did find out, you wouldn't want the story to be that you assigned only one officer to the murder, would you? Surely at least 2 officers is typical for a murder. You can appreciate how that might look suspicious from the media perspective. Alders stared, astonished at Felix. He had never heard anyone talk to the chief of police in this way, and when he turned to stare at Breckenridge, Alders saw the police chief's face had gone from brick red to deep blue, his important-looking mustache quivering with emotion. The chief's features rearranged themselves as the gears turned in his head. Fine, Felix. In light of how thinly stretched our force is at the moment, I'll contract you to work with Alders for this investigation. But if there's one object missing from this crime scene, I'll have you locked up and the key burnt to ashes. Understand? Felix nodded. Keep an eye on him, Alders. He's a slippery character. And with that, Breckenridge stormed out of the little bunker. Felix watched him go, then turned back to Alders. I suppose we'll be working together, he said, holding out his hand. Alders shook it. So I see your name is Sam Alders, Felix continued calmly. Alders blinked. Felix had somehow gotten a hold of his wallet. Detective. GRPD. You seem to have ascended the ranks rather quickly. Is this your wife? Very pretty. How did you get my wallet? Alders demanded. You dropped it, said Felix calmly. I did not drop my wallet, Alders replied angrily. When did you pick my pocket? Pick your pocket? I'd never dream of doing such a thing. Here are your keys back, by the way, Alders said, offering him a small key ring while continuing to leaf through the wallet. AARP membership? You're a bit young for that, aren't you? I thought you had to be 50. Alders snatched the wallet out of Felix's hand and began to quickly count the money inside. Only when he was satisfied that nothing, credit cards, cash, or otherwise, was missing from the wallet, did he look up to discover that Felix had disappeared. This is curious, said Felix's cool, low voice. It was coming from the other side of the divide. Alders, mindful of what the chief had said about Felix possibly burgling the armory, quickly sped around the side of the divider to find Felix inspecting the murder weapon with interest. "Don't touch that," Alders said a bit more imperiously than he'd intended. "It might have forensic evidence." "Perhaps," Felix agreed. "You might eventually get it analyzed, but with the backlog in the city forensics lab, I doubt it will be any time soon." Even so, Felix did not touch the weapon. He bent over it and inspected it carefully. "Would you much mind moving?" Felix said to Alders. "You're blocking my light." Alders shifted a little and Felix squatted down, looking closely at the weapon. It was a long, ancient-looking rifle, propped up, and securely fastened on two wooden stands with a curve to them. "These stands look as if they were already here, judging from the dust and the dirt," Felix commented. "The murderer did not bring these with him." "How do I know you're not the murderer?" Alders demanded. "You seem to know an awful lot about this." "What I know I am deducing," Felix replied calmly. "I can prove I'm not the murderer. If you find the TV crew that was filming here this morning and afternoon, and acquire the video they took, you'll discover I was in the picture the whole time. Since you'll also be able to verify that I was in picture at the time of the gunshot when you replay the video, I think you'll find my position quite unimpeachable. Besides, whatever your chief thinks of me, he doesn't seem to imagine me capable of murder. The thought didn't even cross his mind." Alders gave an unconvinced snort, but Felix seemed to be largely ignoring him, inspecting the murder weapon from various angles. "Why didn't you call the police when you heard the gunshot?" "It was rather noisy. I could have misheard. Besides, I couldn't place the gunshot, and as your chief's reactions probably told you, I'm not exactly in good standing with the GRPD. "How long have you been a detective, Alders?" Felix asked suddenly. "3 years. You're a murder investigator?" "Yes." "And you agree with me that this crime has the appearance of premeditation?" "Yes. The murderer would have to have hidden behind this wooden barrier ahead of time, and waited precisely for the right moment to fire, such that the gunshot was masked by the sounds of the demolition." "Then answer me this. If you were a murderer, why would you use this weapon to commit your premeditated murder?" Alders frowned and bent down to inspect the weapon. "Is there any reason I wouldn't?" Alders asked. "Yes. This weapon is in very poor condition. Look at the crack running down the barrel, and this damage to the stock." Felix stared around the armory. "There are any number of other weapons here that look like they're in better condition, at least at first glance." His eyes skimmed over the line of rifles on an opposite wall. "I'm no firearms expert, but I'd say that if I wanted to commit a murder, I'd use a different weapon. This one is visibly damaged." "It would have been dark in here before the construction workers knocked a hole in the ceiling," Alders pointed out. "Maybe I couldn't have seen the damage to the rifle." "True, but even so, I'm not sure I'd use this rifle. I'd be very interested in the results of the ballistic tests. They'll tell us whether this really was the weapon that killed her." With this observation, he stepped back from the rifle and focused on the floor, looking around. "What are you doing?" asked Alders with interest. "I'm looking for footprints," Felix replied. He ran his eyes along the floor, noting various gaps in the dust and muck, but shook his head. "Nothing definite," he declared reluctantly. "But that's all right. This is the way I prefer it." "What do you mean you prefer it this way?" "It would be all very easy if we found footprints to match the murderer, or fingerprints on the trigger, or a signed confession, or something of that sort. But I like my mysteries to be mysterious, don't you? We have here a dead woman, Miss Adriana Kettering, shot through the heart. If the murder was premeditated, then why use such an ancient weapon? And how did the murderer ensure that Mrs. Kettering was here at exactly the right time? If the murder was not premeditated, then was it simply luck that the killer found himself in this room, with Mrs. Kettering in his gun sights? Was it simply luck that he fired at exactly the right time, so that the gunshot was masked?" Alder's face was stony. "It's too early to say," he answered swiftly. "Is it now?" Felix reached down and scooped something up off the ground a few feet away from the rifle. "What have you got there?" Alders asked, his eyes narrowing. Felix held up a small curly object. It glinted in the light. "It's a spring," Felix announced, after examining it. "A small spring." After rummaging around in his pocket, Alders produced an evidence bag and held it open. With apparent reluctance, Felix dropped the little spring into the bag. Alders examined the spring. It was small, about half the length and width of his little finger, and black with either grease or dirt. "You think this is a clue?" Alders asked with forced politeness. Felix just shrugged. Alders shook his head. We'll get a better picture of things when we start questioning these 6 people you say were speaking to the victim just prior to the murder. You might also want to obtain that video footage I mentioned, as it will be quite useful in exonerating me, Felix continued. I, for my part, will try to find out more about this place. I have a contact at the Department of Defense. This is obviously some sort of military structure. He might be able to tell me more about it, not to mention the rifle. I'd better take some pictures. Felix reached into the pockets of his baggy overcoat and drew out a cell phone, and started snapping pictures of the rifle. Alders stared at it as the little white flash lit the chamber. That's my cell phone, Alders exclaimed with outrage. Is it? My dear Sammy, you should learn to take better care of your things, Felix remarked as he fiddled with the phone. And you should really get Instagram. It makes sending photos so much faster. Here we go. Alders glared at him and held out his hand for his phone back. When Felix returned it to him, Alders started rapidly checking his pockets to make sure nothing else was missing. See you tomorrow, say at the 14th Street station at 9 o'clock, Felix asked, and without waiting for an answer, walked briskly away from the crime scene. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like, and share it with your friends. Death by Nostalgia in its entirety is available on Amazon. There's a link below. See you next time.